I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Okay. That's, we'll have a few seconds until the slides are up. She comes to us from the University of California, Berkeley. Her name is Lauren Ponisio, and she's a PhD candidate with what's called the Kremen Laboratory. And the Kremen Laboratory, Claire Kremen from University of California, Berkeley, is quite a powerhouse. They produce quite a lot of excellent work and a lot of great minds coming out of that lab. So, Lauren.
Okay, thank you. Everyone stretched? Good stretch break? Okay, thank you. So this is a slightly different talk. I'm going to be telling you guys about the culmination of about a 10-year study in the Central Valley of California, looking at whether we can use hedgerows to restore native pollinators. So the alternate title for my talk is Hedgerows, Can We Have Our Cake and Eat It Too? The meaning of which will soon be unveiled. So let's start with a bit of foundations of conservation biology. And this really started with two competing ideologies. On one side of the spectrum, we had John Muir with his preservationist ideals, and he was all about the intrinsic value of species in nature. So every species has a right to exist, and we should just respect that. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have the utilitarian ideals, and this was sort of amplified by Gifford. I always want to say Pinochet, but that's quite pronounced improperly. But he was all about using species for sustainable use. And you can actually see there's maybe a harvested forest in the background. And 200 years later, we haven't moved on very far, except we now use the word ecosystem services to describe this utilitarian ideals. And ecosystem services, you guys are probably familiar with this concept, but it's the idea that nature provides services, and then we get to use, those services in different ways. So for example, with pollination, if we preserve native bees, we get pollination out of it. So, but it's still that really utilitarian, human-centric view. And the big question is, can we use the same techniques to restore biodiversity and also get the ecosystem service benefit out of it? So, can we have our cake and eat it too? So where cake is conservation, so preserving species just for their intrinsic value, and eating that cake is ecosystem services. So, do we also, when we get that biodiversity, do we also get a benefit from it? And where this question is often asked is agroecosystems. So agriculture now occupies about 40% of the planet and is a leading driver of biodiversity loss, along with various other environmental and social harms. This is a pretty quintessential picture of modern conventional industrial agriculture. And though tremendously productive, it has a lot of problems. So we've started to ask, how can we make this landscape more friendly for wildlife and for humans? And one option is this diversified farm. So a diversified farm is a farm that uses various practices to diversify the landscape, much like nature. So we have a variety of, we have row crops, we have orchard crops, we also have these riparian buffers over here. Maybe there's some livestock grown over here. Very importantly, there's this blue pickup truck. That's a very important diversification practice. Nothing works without it. And yeah, tough crowd, guys. And even probably more importantly, especially to our lab group, we have these flowering hedgerows. And these are planted along the margins of fields where they do not remove valuable land from production. So with these hedgerows, we wanted to ask, can we support pollinators? So that's what they're usually planted for. And as we've heard from Scott, there's about 4,000 native bees in North America and about 1,500 in California alone. So California is a hotspot for bee diversity. And they come in all sizes and shapes and life histories. If there was ever a group with intrinsic value, I give you native bees. And of course, ecosystem services, a third of the food we eat is in some way pollinator dependent. And that's either to produce fruit or to produce seeds. So this is a pretty quintessential picture of what a field margin might look like in the California Central Valley, which is a very intensively managed agricultural landscape. So I wanted to ask, okay, so how can we make this landscape better for pollinators? And particularly, we would probably want to restore this landscape to something what it looked like before there was agriculture. And you can imagine maybe the California Central Valley looks something like this. This is actually the Carrizo Plain in Southern California, one of the few intact grasslands left in California. And so you kind of substitute out this desert scrub with maybe some chaparral, and then you'd also have some oak woodlands. So turning this into this. fits. So here we have a combination of perennial chaparral plants as well as grassland forbs, and it's also often integrated with riparian trees that might be found in maybe an oak woodland. So here's another before and after shot. We have, weedy field margin, just a bunch of invasive grasses, not much there for pollinators, and then this is about 5 years later. So these hedgerows are about 5 meters by about maybe 250 meters, and they are, again, planted in a place where farmers would not be cultivating them. So they're planted in a place that would usually be left fallow. So we wanted to ask, with these hedgerows, can we have our cake and eat it too? So can we preserve pollinators just for their own sake of preserving pollinator biodiversity, and do we actually get an ecosystem service benefit from those pollinators? And to ask this question, we really want to compare hedgerows with where hedgerows could be. And we asked this in the California Central Valley. So here's like San Francisco right there, and there we are in the sort of eastern Central Valley. And this landscape covered about 350 kilometers squared, and we had a variety of different sites. So we had unrestored field margins. So this is like where hedgerows could be. We had maturing hedgerows, and these are younger hedgerows planted in collaboration with the Xerxes Society, and they were followed throughout their life. And mature hedgerows, and these have been planted for a variety of reasons. They're all greater than 10 years old. They're very established, have a lot of floral resources for pollinators. So we wanted to start with conservation. So what's the first question you might ask with, we plant these hedgerows, we're looking at a conservation benefit, and we would ask, are they actually promoting pollinator richness? So are we getting more pollinators in hedgerows than we might if we didn't have them there? And for the sake of time, I'm going to summarize the results of a few studies and direct you to where they're published. So question, do hedgerows promote pollinator richness? The answer is yes, and you can go to the publication. But then you might ask, and this is something that I think Gary brought up, who are these pollinators? So this is a stack of Cal Academy drawers. They each have about 1,000 specimens in them, and they're all this little bee called Halictus tripartitus. So you might ask, are we actually preserving species of conservation concern, or are we just making the common species more common? And again, so we ask, do hedgerows actually promote resource specialist species? And the answer again was yes. So things are looking pretty good, but you're playing devil's advocate, and you're asking, are those species actually persisting there? Like, are they just sort of being attracted to the hedgerows, and then the hedgerows can't actually support their populations, so they're just blipping out of existence the next year? But luckily, the answer again was we are actually supporting the persistence of resource specialist pollinators. So things are looking pretty good. And with our last question, we wanted to move from a really local scale, so this is asking at the level of hedgerow, to the scale of the landscape. And we wanted to ask, are hedgerows promoting the spatial heterogeneity of communities across this whole landscape? And spatial heterogeneity is also often called beta diversity, and that's really what determines the number of species a landscape can support. So to illustrate this, imagine we're back at the Central Valley in John Muir's time. He described it as a continuous carpet of wildflowers, and we have these different bee communities. And you can imagine, some of those communities are maybe riparian specialists, some are open grassland specialists, such that even though in each community we have about the same number of species, there's a lot of turnover between them. So between these two communities, there's 5 species total, but 4 of them are not shared. And again, same here. So there's 4 species total, 3 are not shared. So you're getting a lot of turnover between these communities, which is leading to 8 species total in this landscape. Okay, so enter industrial agriculture. We've completely homogenized the habitat. Now we basically just have agriculture, agriculture, agriculture. And eventually, through time, only the species that could persist in that type of habitat would survive. So the communities would turn over, and maybe look something like this. And so even though we have the same number of species in each of these communities, there's basically no turnover. You're getting the same community over and over again. And so at this regional scale, we only have 4 species total. So we wanted to ask, if we throw hedgerows back in the picture, we're promoting some habitat heterogeneity, do we go back to the previous situation? Are we able to restore that community heterogeneity? So we asked, do hedgerows restore community heterogeneity? On the y-axis, we have species turnover. So 0 is like 2 communities are completely identical, and you can imagine the maximum number in this would be 1. So 2 communities share no species. They're completely dissimilar. And we're comparing these 3 types of sites. So we have unrestored field margins, where a hedgerow could be. We have maturing hedgerows. These are these younger, less established hedgerows. And we have mature hedgerows. And rather excitingly, the answer was yes. So we're actually promoting more species turnover between communities and hedgerows. And this is about a 14% difference. And if you look at levels in natural communities, the mature hedgerows have about the same amount of turnover as we'd expect in natural communities. So that was pretty exciting. And interestingly, the maturing hedgerows don't have the same level of turnover. So you're actually seeing an effect that's increasing through time as the hedgerows establish themselves. And we kind of want to ask, okay, so why might this be the case? Why aren't we seeing very much heterogeneity in those unrestored sites in agriculture? And so back to this picture, and you can imagine, we have this big species pool, like this, the total number of species that can survive in the Central Valley. And then we have what can survive in those unrestored field margins. And you can imagine that not all species might be able to survive there, and particularly there's like a filter that only lets certain species through, such that you're only getting, a few in those unrestored field margins. And that would particularly have to do with their life history traits. So, and so over larger spatial scales, if you're only getting the same species over and over again, you're not going to get a lot of heterogeneity. And again, this would all have to do with their traits. So as Scott brought up, so bees really need 2 things. They need food in form of nectar and pollen, and they need shelter. And there's a whole variety of different places that bees nest. Some nest underground, some nest in woody material. And depending on their resource needs, this is going to lead to differences in their life histories. So we looked at a few life history traits. We looked at floral specialization. So some species are very generalized. They visit whatever they want. And some species are very specialized on a couple species. We also looked at body size. So body size will determine both how much resources a bee needs and also how far they can forage to get those resources. And we also looked at their nesting habits. So that's in terms of whether they rent existing holes, so like whether they find a hole and then use it, or whether they're actually constructing nests, and whether they're nesting above or below ground. So we thought that these various traits might determine whether a bee could survive in an unrestored field margin. And the way we can test that is we have this large species pool, and we can actually simulate what it would look like if we randomly sampled species from that pool. So we draw a certain subset, and then we draw another subset, and we draw another subset. And we look at the traits of those randomly assembled communities. And you can imagine that if what you have in an unrestored field margin has nothing to do with your traits, it would look just like a randomly assembled community. So to illustrate that, here's specialization. So this is kind of like the span of specialization values we might see. And this is what random communities look like. This is their range of specialization values. And this is what our observed value is. So this is saying that at unrestored field margins, bees are less specialized than you would expect if you just put together communities randomly. And we see that with every trait we looked at. So bees are smaller, bees have less nest location diversity, and less nest construction diversity. All of these things are suggesting that we can only have certain traits at these unrestored field margins. And so they're mostly generalists, they're mostly small, they mostly nest underground, which makes a lot of sense because there's not a lot of above ground materials in unrestored field margins. And they're mostly renting spaces that are already existing. They're not doing a lot of nest construction. So all of these things together are supporting our hypothesis that basically these unrestored field margins are acting like a really strong filter. You only get certain species there, and so that when you look at really broad spatial scales, you're getting the same community over and over and over again. And we don't see that effect with hedgerows. So hedgerows support bees with a variety of life history traits. So when we put this all together, we have that, there's more bees at hedgerows. We're supporting both resource specialists and generalists, and those species are actually persisting at hedgerows. And you can imagine through time, we're accumulating differences between communities. And that is leading, on the landscape scale, to community spatial heterogeneity. So things are looking pretty good for conservation and hedgerows. So the real question is, okay, do we have our cake? It's looking really good. Do we get to eat that cake? So do we actually see an ecosystem service benefit? The first question you might ask, are hedgerows actually supporting the pollinators that do the crop pollination? And here we're looking at species occurrence. So you can imagine you have 0, very little species occurrence, and that number eventually goes all the way to 1. And we're looking again at those 3 different types of sites, so unrestored margins and the 2 different types of hedgerows. And we see something really similar to what we saw with the spatial heterogeneity, where you're getting increased persistence, or increased occurrence of crop pollinators and through time. So mature hedgerows are supporting more crop pollinators than maturing hedgerows, and the least amount is at those unrestored field margins. So looking pretty good. We're not just supporting any old bees in those hedgerows, we're actually supporting the crop pollinators. Then you might ask, are those crop pollinators actually ending up in the fields? Or are they just visiting hedgerows, staying there, and not actually getting into the crops? And to look at this question, we're looking at distance into the field. So you can imagine there's either a hedgerow or an unrestored margin right here. And we first looked at canola. And so when we compare hedgerows to these unrestored field margins, we see that we get almost twice the number of bee species across, up to 200 meters into the field in these systems. And we also looked at the same question in tomato, which is a less attractive plant to pollinators, and we saw the same effect. So things are looking pretty good. We have crop pollinators, they're in the fields, so the big money question is, do we actually see a yield benefit? And this question was looked at in sunflower. So we counted a lot of sunflower seeds. And so we're comparing again the unrestored controls and the hedgerows. And we're really, really hoping this would be good. But we see absolutely no difference. And in fact, the only thing that affected crop yields was sunflower variety. So, that was kind of a pickle. And especially given what we know about these systems. And particularly in the same area, in watermelon, an extremely pollinator-dependent crop. If you are a farm near natural habitat, native bees provided 100% of your pollination needs. And you see a pretty similar thing in almond, where the more diversity of native bees you have in your crop fields and the more visitation, the higher your fruit set. So why aren't hedgerows providing the same benefit as natural habitat? One question might be honeybees. So sunflower farmers stock the fields with incredible numbers of honeybees, so tens of thousands of honeybees. So maybe we're just at our yield limit. Everything is basically getting pollinated, and even though the native bees are there, we have so many honeybees that it's not really seeing an effect. The other is sunflower is kind of a weird crop. We've split it into male and female flowers. So native bees are mostly collecting pollen. And so if they're just staying on the male flowers, they're not really providing much of a pollination gain. So it might just be about the biology of the crop. The other is we actually, because sunflowers are a North American crop, we have our own sunflower bee. And this bee just loves sunflower so much that it actually nests at the base of sunflower. It doesn't really move out of sunflower fields. We found that it just likes to stay in the field and never leave, and particularly never use hedgerows. We catch very few of them in the hedgerows. So maybe the bees that are doing the pollination aren't actually relying on hedgerows at all. They're mostly just relying on the sunflower resources. And the last comment is, so this is a sunflower field in the Central Valley. You see the little hedgerow over there. And you can just see the scale of it. So, how this small hedgerow, 5 meter by about 250 meter hedgerow, maybe it's not enough to provide that yield benefit. And what we really need is sort of an integration of a lot of different practices to get that yield benefit. So we don't just need hedgerows, we need hedgerows and crop rotation, or hedgerows and riparian buffers and things like that. So we need an integration of different techniques. So back to our ecosystem services question. We have our crop pollinators, they're in the fields, but maybe we see a yield benefit, maybe we don't, and it's going to be really context dependent. So to summarize, conservation. We got higher species richness in hedgerows. We're supporting both generalists and specialists, and those bees are actually persisting in hedgerows. So they're using them as a resource throughout their lifetime. And on broad spatial scales, we're seeing increased community heterogeneity like what we'd expect in natural landscapes. So we have this gorgeous cake. It's absolutely fantastic. All these different layers, really beautiful. It's looking really good for conservation. And then we look at ecosystem services, we don't quite see such a good effect. We're supporting crop pollinators, they're in the fields, but that yield benefit may or may not be realized. So, you know, you cut a piece of cake, and you're really excited about it, and you open it up, and it's panettone. It's fruitcake. And you know, you might really like fruitcake. Like that might be exactly what you need on your farm, but you might not. So you kind of have to decide on when you're trying to promote these different restoration techniques, who your audience is, and what their goals are. And maybe we can't always rely on the yield benefit argument. So with that, I'd like to thank my wonderful lab at UC Berkeley, especially my advisor, Claire Kremen, and all of our various funding sources, including the USDA, the NSF, and the Army resources to do food security work. And I'd like to leave you with this beautiful picture of a bee so you can absorb its intrinsic value. And I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Lauren. Yes, so one question right here.
That was excellent. Thank you very much. I wanted to comment on your very closing comment about different crops and different scenarios. A few years ago, Jennifer Hopwood from the Xerces Society spoke about a similar topic here in Missouri, and she cited an example of melon agriculture in California. And in that study that she cited, some of the productive field was no longer in production, but planted with native species, and the yields went up and the production costs went down. And so I just wondered if you were familiar with that study, because that seems to suggest that what you were trying to find was the case in that study. So I don't know if you were familiar with that or some other similar studies.
I really think that depending on what your crop is, you may or may not receive the yield benefit. And watermelon particularly is pollinated by a very specialized bee called Peponapis. It's a squash bee. And honeybees don't do the best job at pollinating squash flowers. They're kind of strange shaped and they're just not very good at it. So you can imagine in that situation, those native pollinators are really important to provide pollination. Another example is cranberry. Honeybees are terrible at pollinating cranberry. Native bees are much better. But we rotate crops, right? We move them around, and the sunflower moves every year. So some years you might have a hedgerow next to you, some years you might not. And so you can imagine it's really important not just to have a couple hedgerows in the landscape, but to really, you know, extend this on a landscape scale such that you're a farmer, you've invested in this hedgerow, but you know that not every single year you're going to realize a yields benefit depending on, you know, where your crop is. But over time, you might be seeing that depending on where your rotations end up.
Yes, one question right here.
Yeah, so my question or point really is an extension of yours. Are you planning to model the cost difference between bringing in pollinators to not artificially, but to pollinate seasonally versus sustainably introducing the type of diversity that you think is needed over a management practice for specific crops so as to look at what the differential costs are, because that's what most producers are particularly interested in, not so much just the yield benefit, but what's the overall cost difference between these different management practices.
Yeah, we have a study that's currently in process where we're looking at the economic benefit of these hedgerows. And it can be a very difficult thing to quantify because, as we've brought up, hedgerows are not just supporting pollinators, they're supporting other beneficial insects that provide pest control, they're providing water filtration. But just focusing on pollination, if I remember correctly, I think it takes about 4 years to pay off the hedgerow, depending on what crops you're growing. And really, the hedgerow has pretty low maintenance. Really, at first, it's the cost of installation and the cost of kind of keeping those plants alive for the first couple of years. But after about year 4, and I think Scott would talk more about this, they do pretty well by themselves. So after you take the 4 years of maintenance and you look at over time, how much you might realize, and also depending on the cost of honeybees. So some people think that honeybees, as we saw, 40% decline this year, so the worst we've ever seen, those prices are just going to keep going up and up. And so farmers might be more and more willing to maybe stock fields less and let the native bees take over. And it would be, you can imagine, instead of relying on, honeybees are basically a crop, right? So instead of relying on just one crop, we're relying on a diversity of crop to provide those services. So that system just might be more sustainable in the long run, in case honeybees do take a really, really big hit. Well.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions.
So you familiar with the portfolio effect?
The portfolio effect,
portfolio.
Yes.
Okay, so you have this large diversity of bees all over, and so it's trying to partition the value among your various groups. Have you considered then incorporating that community turnover diversity as an actual value into so basically you say it's not the value that you're being provided today, but the fact that you're hedging your bets into the future.
Yeah.
If you rotate your crop and there's Peponapis over here, versus some other bee.
Yeah, so to summarize, the portfolio effect is sort of one of the hypotheses of why diversity is important. Is the idea that we have, in this particular example, bees with a bunch of different life histories, a drought happens, and the bees that are able to resist that drought are able to survive, and then so you're getting less fluctuations through time if you have a higher diversity. And actually, there's a great study by Garibaldi et al. That took actually our study and a bunch of others and found that with more natural habitat, you get greater stability of pollination services. And so that's another very important thing to farmers. So you're getting a much more constant services through time, such that if there's some environmental fluctuation, it's not just going to disappear like if we only rely on honeybees.
Just one last question.
In this part of the country, the so-called Midwest, hedgerows were historically planted as a answer to the Dust Bowl. Why are hedgerows planted in California? Is there any reason that they might address?
So our maturing hedgerows were planted with the Xerces Society, particularly for pollinators. And a lot of our mature hedgerows were planted for biological control. So supporting various populations that are controlling aphids and things like that. They also provide windbreaks. They also help with evaporation off of canals and water filtration. So I mean, there's a variety of services they're providing. I would say particularly in terms of insects was what people were thinking though.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you to Lauren.